I'm Elizabeth Cohen and I'm a potter. I'm a studio potter here in Wellesley, Massachusetts. I work in the medium of porcelain clay, and it's pretty minimal, kind of inspired by nature. I want the clay to look soft even when it's fired, so a lot of curves, no straight lines, that kind of thing. In making things with my hands, and even as far as I can remember, I was always picking up shells and stuff on the beach, or gluing stuff. Even when I was watching TV, I'd be drawing. So I've always been drawn to making things with my hands, cooking, anything, building with Legos. So that has just stayed with me as I've grown. I used to teach high school English, and that allowed me to be creative as well, but I always wanted to be an artist. So after I had my third child, I decided to really devote to practicing and reading and watching videos and try to learn, and here I am about 15, 20 years later. So my inspiration is generally speaking from nature. I look at shapes and the way things are formed, seeds and shells, and the way things wear away, decay and rot and growth. So the cycle of how things evolve. And I'm really inspired by, in terms of art history, by Asian ceramics, the Korean and Japanese and Chinese ancient ceramic aesthetic. And other artists I really admire are, I love Julia Galloway. I love her approach. I love the way she's so joyous, and the way she teaches and performs, and there's so many others. I also enjoy watching other potters work in different kinds of clay, different kinds of firing methods that are so different from mine. Wood firing and raku, pit firing, other atmospheric kinds of firing that give such different results and such beauty, and also reference nature and art history and different cultures. So, the porcelain has this mystique. It is notoriously finicky to work with in terms of throwing or hand building. It's very difficult to hand build with, but it doesn't tolerate getting wet, so you have to throw in a very fast or straightforward or somewhat dry method, and it just takes practice, that's all. But the reason I was drawn to it is because it's really, really smooth, and it doesn't have a lot of grog in it, so it doesn't have the little chunks of particulate in clay. And because it's so smooth, and because the result is so fine, that when it's fired, it can look almost like the clay is still wet and soft. And I put a satin matte glaze on, which again enhances that feeling. So if I make the same form in stoneware or an earthenware, even though I'm throwing it the same method, the same process, it will look completely different just because of the clay. So that's why I like porcelain, because it translates to the aesthetic that I'm going for. It also feels really good to work with. Of great concern to me is the current political and cultural climate, that artists really need to feel they can express themselves. I'm concerned that censorship might be weighing down its heavy hand, and that it's time, in these times, it's even more important for everyone, especially creative people, artists, writers, dancers, to express and react. We have almost an obligation to do that, and as a role in the culture for what we do. I think these are really serious times, and I made a few pieces that express that in a way that I think is, I guess it's not terribly overt, but it's pretty strong. When the elections happened, for the last election, presidential election, I had some really strong feelings. So I made a series of pieces using the egg as the basic form. Again, a form that's from nature, very pure form that's very familiar. When you think of the egg, as a symbol of life and renewal, but this was a much darker take on that form. And I carved into the egg, which allowed me to be a little bit more meditative and slow and think about how I was feeling. And then I also wanted the piece to be, you have to sort of either have the piece spinning or you walk around the piece, but you have to sort of interact with the piece to fully understand it. And it's not a functional piece. Usually I make function work, but this demanded something else. I was teaching deaf-blind students at the Perkins School in Watertown. It's a very famous school where Helen Keller went. And I was so inspired by the way these students could communicate through their tactile sense, which is so highly developed, but they could just have joy, they could express all their feelings, and also Braille is something they could create from clay, not just the little bumps on the paper, but you could create little bumps with clay. So that whole idea of how people who communicate with their hands, sign language, touch, Braille, can use clay to write and speak and say things that are in words, not just the sculpture, the thing they're creating. So as I was working on this political piece, I was thinking about people who are suppressed in the way they can communicate for political reasons, socioeconomic reasons, fear, lack of opportunity, whatever their circumstances are. And so I made this poem that I carved. I did the poem also in Braille, and I made the Braille really, really spiky. So if you touch it, it's pretty painful, actually. I have to carry it really carefully because it hurts. But I wanted it to be spiky as opposed to the nice soft round Braille that you might typically see. I think we are so lucky now to be in the age of the internet. It's endless. It's almost too much. So I think as someone who's starting out could get easily overwhelmed. So I would encourage someone to trust your instincts. I think we know more about what we really need and want than we give ourselves credit for. So trust your instincts and try and focus on something that really resonates with you. Not what everyone else is doing, what's popular, what the latest fad is, but what resonates with you. And then pursue that. So if you're really interested in, let's say, the way cultures build houses, look at that and then look at different forms of the way houses might be and shelter might be represented, and then sketch that and think about how that might translate to a functional form. The roof being the lid, or turn it on its side, or whatever you want to do, but focus on that and then just go with that. And there will be so much out there for you on the internet. The other thing I would say, and that's more, the building your own aesthetic. Really encourage you to build your aesthetic, not the latest workshop fad aesthetic. The other thing I would encourage you to do is just absorb and read and practice, and get used to the fact that you're going to make some pots or pieces that you're not satisfied with. That happens to me all the time, and that's okay. That's really part of the process. So be really kind to yourself and forgiving of yourself, because you just need to practice like any skill you're going to develop, and that when you think you've failed, you really haven't failed. It's a learning opportunity to assess what you're doing and really take a step back and evaluate and move forward.